You're with the briefing on BBC News. The headlines. The European Union is set to advise businesses across the continent how best to get ready for a no-deal Brexit. The UK government is to promise a post-Brexit shake-up of the immigration system, focusing on people's skills, not nationality. So let's look at these stories in more detail and others in the global media. The Financial Times has on its front page concern that the Prime Minister will defy business fears to push through the immigration curbs. It says the Prime Minister has infuriated cabinet colleagues and business leaders to cut EU immigration with tough visa requirements. Then The Guardian is looking at the implications of Brexit to businesses, who are saying to be watching in horror as the government confirmed over £2 billion will be spent and 3,000 service personnel put on standby for a no deal. BuzzFeed, in the meantime, is looking at the politics within Westminster, which it says it looks at Brexiteers have called a Christmas truce with Theresa May, but outlines why those Leave-supporting Tories, seeing this as a season of goodwill, may be getting behind her for the first time, but Remainers have stepped up their attack on the Prime Minister. Now let's move on from Brexit for a little bit. We've got Japan Times leading with a significant development in the government's defence policy there. A new 10-year policy will see a total spending of 27 trillion yen, over $200 billion, for the deployment of aircraft carriers for the first time since the end of the Second World War, and more investment on cyber security. And then Gulf News, its business pages look at the prospects for the global economy in the new year. Growth fears grip global stock markets. It has a negative outlook, says the drop in the dollar and the tumble in the price of oil looks set to force the US Federal Reserve to deliver a fourth interest rate hike of the year. That's expected today, of course. And then The Independent, their lead story is the sacking of Jose Mourinho by Manchester United after one of the team's worst runs. The paper says he was simply out of time. He's on most of the front pages, actually, in the UK. Oliver Cornock is with us, Editor-in-Chief of Oxford Business Group. Welcome back. So let's start with the FT, and this is the discussion about immigration. We've talked about it already to a degree. The white paper is going to be published today on what immigration policy is set to look like in the future, post-Brexit. And this article, the FT talking about Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, Greg Clark, the Business Secretary, both of them, you know, they don't say up in arms, but not happy at all about what's proposed.
No, they're not happy, are they, Sally? And of course, Philip Hammond has been a real champion of a more moderate Brexit. He's really got businesses' backs, it seems. UK business is very concerned about this, Sally. So much of the Brexit referendum debate centred around immigration. There was a huge groundswell against immigration. And whether that forms part of a broader global rhetoric towards nationalist tendencies, I think, is an important point. But either way, employment in the UK is at an all-time high, really. Business needs immigrants. Business needs skilled immigrants, many of whom have come from the EU. Many of those EU immigrants are very familiar with the UK. They speak very good English. So business is saying, look, we do need some sort of deal with this. Theresa May's plan here is to set a minimum £30,000 salary, give certain visa restrictions. We don't yet know what those are.
There's going to be like a point system, isn't there?
Exactly,
That's the
rather like the Australian system, as I understand it. But of course, as somebody who covers the global economy, I'm thinking actually we need to be putting the UK on a global footing. Let's look beyond that. Let's send the right messages out with our EU policy and maybe set that as the global policy. And we haven't got any of that information. And what is so frustrating here, what business really wants is some clarity, not to get beyond the EU rhetoric. And that's what this is, I'm afraid.
It's quite interesting, of course, because we mustn't forget that Theresa May was the Home Secretary for a very long time, and immigration was a big deal for her. They had targets that they were missing. It was constantly in the press, the fact that the government was not hitting their immigration targets, which they set for themselves. This is something that she's seen to be, you know, a champion of curbing immigration. And yet, as you say, the business community, in fact, many business leaders that I interview talk about the fact that they're finding it quite difficult to find the workers they want. Because it's not just the curbing of immigration, but also people's perception of coming to work in the UK, given what's going on with Brexit. They're not so keen. They'd rather maybe go and work in Berlin or
absolutely. And Sally, I
Paris
think that's a really,
or even in New York.
I think that's a really important point, Sally. We need to think about the UK's image in Europe, but also the rest of the world. What message does this send out? How is the UK, how is Theresa May's government positioning the UK as a place to live, work and hopefully play? Because at the moment, it ain't looking particularly rosy. And if I were a young person in Berlin thinking, oh, I speak great English, I might want to go and work for, let's say, a global research company, would I be thinking about coming to the UK at the moment? I think, let's just wait 6 months. That is not good. And we know that business is doing the same. And sentiment is everything.
So we shall keep an eye on that today as this white paper is released. No doubt there'll be much more discussion about that tomorrow. But on the other hand, The Guardian on its front page, talks about businesses watching in horror as the plans for a no-deal Brexit are sort of outlined. And some of the other papers here in the UK have got, pictures of people from the army, etc. The deployment of personnel on the streets, 3,500, etc., etc. It's all getting very real, isn't it?
And perhaps it needs to get real. I mean, she's damned if she does, she's damned if she doesn't. If she doesn't put in contingencies, everyone says, why the hell isn't she putting in contingencies? If she does, apparently she's scaremongering. I think this is part of a broader story that actually it does look increasingly like these negotiations are going to go right to the wire. And perhaps they need to go right to the wire because, as I've always said, in a negotiation, you have to have the option of walking away, Sally. If you were to buy a house, you'd need to be able to say, actually, the price is not right for me, I'm going to walk away.
BuzzFeed, though, are saying Brexiteers have called a Christmas truce with Theresa May. This is about the turmoil within the Conservative Party, but actually the Remainers are now stepping up their attacks on her.
A wonderful moment
yesterday. She doesn't
yesterday.
ever get a rest, does she?
Well, wasn't it a wonderful moment watching those people that actually called for a vote of no confidence in their leader, who suddenly turned around to support them, those Brexiteers such as Jacob Rees-Mogg, suddenly actually saying they would steal their Tories through and through. And then, of course, the Remainers, who had actually been rather more on side with the sort of doomed Chequers deal, suddenly being rather more negative and rather more anti Mrs May. I mean, what a position. I think to the rest of the world, I speak to people all over the world and they think, goodness me, Mrs May has got some, steel in her bones.
Yeah, absolutely. She's definitely got stamina, that's for sure. Right, let's look at the Japan Times now. Totally changing the subject. This is really interesting. Smack on the front page. Defence plan targets new warfare domains. 27 trillion yen will be spent over a 5-year period, a record number in terms of spending. This is a Japanese economy that's not doing particularly well at the moment. All its latest GDP figures have been worse than expected. The projection isn't that good for next year. Give us your take on this.
Well, I think just to start on this, I think this is a significant shift in Japanese politics, actually.
It's a huge shift.
This is a pacifist constitution, Sally, isn't it? I mean, since the Second World War, Japan's defence policy has all been about defence with a big D, no offensive policy. And they're saying that isn't actually changing, despite arming ships and things. Now, how you can say that I've got a surface air-to-air missile in my pocket, but it's just there for defence. I think it is important, but it does speak to the broader position in the world, makes us in the UK debating Brexit pale into insignificance here. And you can sort of say, well, actually, why wouldn't Japan look to defend itself? China is the hugest global growth story, really, in terms of its influence. The US yesterday came through and said our most significant national security challenge is from China. What's more, not from conventional warfare, Sally, but from sort of asymmetric warfare, cyber. And it's really interesting that not only is this about arming these helicopters and ships, but also about having a policy towards cyber defence. I think that's really interesting.
Stood out to me, actually, because actually, in this day and age, that is as important, many would say, as, the boots on the ground, the cyber security policy, the plan, the money going into that.
And I think, so much of us in the Western Hemisphere are obsessed by what's going on here, and we're missing what's going on in the South China Sea. We're missing what's going on with China. We're missing what's going on with India. And so this is a really interesting ratcheting up of one of the world's biggest economies.
Now let's look at Gulf News, their business page. Growth fears grip world stock markets. I mean, today we're seeing, the Dow and the main markets in the US up slightly, having had two very awful days of massive losses. Today in Asia it's a bit mixed. Of course, we've got the Federal Reserve meeting, but there is investor anxiety out there. This is what this Gulf News article is all about what is to come in 2019 and 2020, because there are so many elements that we just cannot predict. I mean, Brexit's just one part of a big jigsaw, isn't it?
It is. It's just one part of that global story, Sally. And when you look at the meeting that happened in Papua New Guinea a couple of weeks ago, no agreement from that. You look at the increasing rhetoric between the US and China. It does interestingly seem that China has backed down on some of its policies. Oil prices down, the dollar down. The only thing up, interestingly, on this story is gold, which is, of course, always a safe haven in these times. But one of the comments in here that really struck me about the outlook is that last year, and indeed in 2008, so many of the asset classes were considered safe havens. This year, they're all down.
Well, next year, or even this Christmas, Jose Mourinho will perhaps be enjoying himself, because all the papers are talking about the fact that he's got a £15 million payoff, despite the fact that Jose gets the boot, as the Daily Express says. Yeah. We've got here Out of Time and The Independent. I mean, every paper's got him on the front page. I have to hands up, I'm not a football fan, but it's a really interesting story, not least because I travel around the world to all parts of the world. And what do people want to talk about? CEOs, chairman, the UK Premier League. And so actually, Jose Mourinho is somebody, or Jose Mourinho, as I should say, is somebody who I've heard about. And then I read... The special one, he was known as.
The special one, but of course he's fallen from favour pretty quickly. Not invested in young players' development, despite spending £400 million on 11 players. I mean, some businessmen around the world love those sorts of budgets to recruit with. And then his payoff, anything between 5 million on some papers to 20 million. I just wonder whether Theresa May might be having a headline like this in March, Sally. Out of time.
We shall watch this space. Thanks a lot, Oliver. Thank you too for your company. See you soon.